Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are going to be looking at the Bad Boys Trilogy. At this point, I don't know if there will be a Bad Boys 4, but let's go back and look at this series of movies and just see what made them popular in the first place, and if they even hold up by today's standards. Now, there will be spoilers for all three movies, and more specifically, Bad Boys for Life. The third movie relies on a twist that I'll get to when we get that far into it, so if you don't want Bad Boys for Life spoiled for you, then stop watching this now. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the blog, MetrObeliskradio.blogspot.com, to stay up to date with all of the MetrObelisk Radio uploads. I will post there before I post to social media. So, with that said, without further delay, let's tear right into the Bad Boys Trilogy. As always with these episodes, we start by looking at the creative team, and the first people I want to look at are the directors in this franchise. So, the first director that we're going to look at is Michael Bay, director of the first Bad Boys and Bad Boys 2. Now, fun fact, Bad Boys was Michael Bay's directorial debut. Now, he also directed movies such as The Rock with Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery, Armageddon with Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck, Pearl Harbor with Ben Affleck and Alec Baldwin, and the first Transformers in the first 5 Transformers movies from Paramount. The first 3 with Shia LaBeouf and the last 2 with Mark Wahlberg. And the last directors I want to look at are the ones that did Bad Boys for Life, and that is Adil and Bilal, I think is how you pronounce their names. Adil El Abri and Bilal Fallah. They're both Belgian filmmakers that, honestly, before this movie even came out, I had never heard of. They did a couple of indie films over in Belgium called Black, Image, and Gangsta. And yeah, from what it looks like, Bad Boys for Life is the first American movie that they've ever directed. Now let's take a look at the writers, and we're going to start with the writers of the first Bad Boys movie. So the first guy I want to look at is George Gallo. Now, he wrote the story for the movie, but the 2 other movies that most people might know that he wrote were Midnight Run with Robert De Niro and Charles Grodin, and Trapped in Paradise with Nicolas Cage and John Lovitz. Then we have Michael Berry and Jim Mulholland. They were both writers for the screenplay. Now, they were both primarily television writers that worked on David Letterman and wrote some stuff for the Academy Awards, but they also wrote the movie Oscar with Sylvester Stallone. And the final writer on Bad Boys would be Doug Richardson. Now, he's probably wrote the most out of the other 2. He wrote Die Hard 2, Money Train with Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson, Welcome to Mooseport with Ray Romano and Gene Hackman, and Hostage with Bruce Willis. So we have different writers for Bad Boys 2. We're starting with Marianne and Cormac Wibberley. They wrote movies such as The Sixth Day with Arnold Schwarzenegger, both the National Treasure movies with Nicolas Cage, The Shaggy Dog with Tim Allen, and wrote some episodes of LA's Finest. And for those of you who don't know what LA's Finest is, that was the spin-off of Bad Boys 2, focusing on Sid, the character from this movie. Then we have Ron Shelton, who wrote such movies as Bull Durham with Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon, White Men Can't Jump with Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes, Tin Cup with Kevin Costner and Rene Russo, and he also worked on the LA's Finest TV series as a writer. And the final writer for Bad Boys 2 would be Jerry Stahl. Now, he primarily worked on television, but he wrote on shows such as Moonlighting with Bruce Willis, Northern Exposure, Twin Peaks, and most famously CSI. Now let's move into Bad Boys for Life. The first writer we're looking at here is Peter Craig. He wrote the movie The Town with Ben Affleck, The Hunger Games, Mockingjay, Parts 1 and 2, Bloodfather with Mel Gibson, and 12 Strong with Chris Hemsworth and Michael Pena. Then we have Joe Carnahan, who is a writer-director, probably the most famous of the writers of Bad Boys for Life. He wrote movies such as Blood, Guts, Bullets, and Octane, which was also his directorial debut, Narc, Smokin' Aces, Pride and Glory, the movie with Edward Norton about the family of cops. He also wrote the A-Team reboot starring Liam Neeson and Bradley Cooper, and he even wrote the Death Wish remake with Bruce Willis. Now, the final writer that we're going to get to is Chris Bremner, and so far, Bad Boys for Life is his only writing credit. Now, typically, I don't talk about producers on the creative team because one producer is basically the same as the other, but I feel like with how big of a name these 2 producers are, I needed to talk about them, and those producers were Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson. Let's start with Jerry Bruckheimer. Jerry Bruckheimer produced movies such as the Beverly Hills Cop series, Top Gun, Days of Thunder, Crimson Tide, The Rock, Con Air, Gone in 60 Seconds, and Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, he moved over into television, and famously with, Crime Scene Investigation, CSI, The Amazing Race, Lucifer, and Cold Case, which is one of my favorite cop procedurals. And then we have Don Simpson, who worked very closely with Jerry Bruckheimer. He worked on the Beverly Hills Cop movies with them, Top Gun, Days of Thunder, Bad Boys, Crimson Tide, and The Rock. Now, these two guys, Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson, were a dynamic duo up until Don Simpson's death in 1996. The last movie that he has a producing credit on is The Rock with Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery. So now with all this creative team out of the way, let's get right into the first Bad Boys movie. So let's start off with the characters. Now, we're going to start off with Will Smith as Mike Lowry. He was the bachelor trust funder who still remains as a cop, even though he's pretty much set for life in this movie. At this point, he's only in the job for the adventure and not the paycheck. Now contrast that with Martin Lawrence as Marcus Burnett, who's the family man who basically goes into the office as if being a cop is just like a 9 to 5 to him. Clocks in at 9 and he's out the door by 5. Basically is all Marcus Burnett is in this movie. Then we have Joe Pantoliano as Captain Howard. He's the captain of the narcotics unit that Marcus Burnett and Mike Lowry are a part of. He's the standard police captain where he's always angry about anything and everything and just wants to get shit done so he can just go home at the end of the day. Then we have Téa Leoni as Julie, who is the witness that the plot mainly focuses around. Mike and Marcus have to protect her from a drug kingpin trying to kill her because she saw too much, aka Welcome to Miami in 1995. Then we have Teresa Randall as Teresa Burnett. Now, she's in a good amount of the movie, so she's getting talked about here. Basically, she's just here for Marcus's character to give the two characters of Mike and Marcus some quote-unquote odd couple feeling, Marcus being the family man and Mike being the rich bachelor. So Bad Boys narratively is actually rather simple. So on the surface, it's a standard action movie surrounding cops instead of this big buff action heroes. Basically, a drug kingpin stole a bunch of heroin from Miami PD. Surprise, surprise, Miami PD is just sitting on a bunch of heroin. Now let's look at this at the glass half full and just say that the cops were noble and wanted to get the drugs off the street. The glass half empty says that the Miami PD is dealing in it, and it wouldn't surprise me given their history with the war on drugs. Now, to get back to the surface level plot, it's up to Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett to find out who stole the heroin and bring them in before the FBI and DEA get involved. During this movie, they had to protect a witness that saw her friend get murdered by this drug kingpin. But what works about this movie? Because it sure as shit isn't that simple action movie plot. And what does this movie have that made up this huge fan base around it? And I'll give you that answer. It's the character dynamic between Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett. When they have to protect the witness, Julie, Marcus has to act like Mike to get her trust. Mike, the rich bachelor, and Mike has to act like Marcus, the family man with the wife and 3 kids. This movie becomes more of an odd couple comedy as a result because the two of them are acting like each other. It causes both characters to start butting heads. And that was the charm in this first movie, because even though Mike and Marcus were butting heads trying to act like each other, they still had each other's back. So at some point, the standard action movie plot of take down this drug kingpin becomes secondary to this odd couple. And I feel for a first movie in a franchise that actually works to build up your characters. So what was the reception for the first Bad Boys movie? Well, on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has a critic score of 43% out of 63 critic reviews and an audience score of 78% out of 660,763 audience reviews. Now, this movie has a Metacritic score of 53 out of only 10 critic reviews, and there's no user score on Metacritic because the movie came out in 1995. This movie sits on IMDb at a 6.9 out of 10, and that's out of 230,999 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $19 million back in 1995. Adjusted for inflation in 2020 dollars, that would be a budget of $31,964,507.87. And it grossed worldwide back in 1995 $141,407,024. Now, adjusted for inflation in 2020 dollars, that would be $237,895,049.06. So what was the studio's ROI? That's return on investment. Their ROI was 744.2%. So let's end this first section off with my final thoughts on the first Bad Boys movie. Now, this is an action movie that doesn't really rely on over-the-top action to sell it. What this movie had was a charm between the characters, and I believe that that's why people still go back and watch this movie from time to time. If it was nothing but action set pieces and bad one-liners, then this movie simply wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked back in 1995, and it wouldn't have worked now. This is the biggest difference between blockbusters 25 to 30 years ago and the blockbusters today. All blockbusters do today is sell themselves on their action set pieces. The characters become secondary, whereas in a blockbuster like Bad Boys, the characters came first. If you don't have well-written characters for any movie, especially blockbusters, then there's no reason for the viewer to ever watch that particular movie ever again. Now let's jump over to Bad Boys 2, and we're going to start with the returning characters in this movie. So we're going to talk about Mike Lowrey and Marcus Burnett together because their character growth arcs are tied together in this one. These two characters are fighting for most of the movie, but then by the end, they learn to settle their differences and basically become, partners for life, bad boys for life. The first movie was about these two characters appreciating each other by the end, but in this one, this movie really puts their partnership to the test. We then get Captain Howard. Now, he's only back in a handful of scenes, really there to be for comic relief. And he always comes in after Mike and Marcus screw something up in this movie, and that's fine for this one. And then we have Teresa Burnett come back, and she's only in a few scenes in this movie, and she really didn't need to be there for any more than that, because this character served her purpose. She was in the first movie to create the perception that Marcus Burnett was this, family man with a wife and 3 kids. By the second movie, we are well past that, past this character development. Now let's talk about the new characters in Bad Boys 2. The first one we have is Jordi Moya as Johnny Tapia. Now, he's the Cuban drug lord that's the antagonist in this movie, and now he takes on a bigger presence than the drug lord from the first movie, and that's fine. This movie can't just be Marcus and Mike being in an odd couple comedy again. It just wouldn't work. This movie needed to focus more on the police work aspect, be more of a police procedural. Then we have Gabrielle Union as Sid, who is Marcus Burnett's sister that works for the DEA. This character's purpose really by the end is just to extend the movie by 30 minutes. If the movie just made her the girl that Mike Lowrey was dating instead of making her this DEA agent, the movie would have been better off for it, and I'll expand on this point later. And finally, we get to Peter Stormare as Alexei, the Russian club owner that was forced into working with Johnny Tapia. I'm only bringing up this character because it's Peter Stormare. Where can you go wrong with this guy? Now let's move on into the narrative of Bad Boys 2. So the action movie plot on the surface is Mike and Marcus need to bring down this Cuban drug lord that deals in ecstasy, but they run into problems when it's later revealed that the guy is almost untouchable because the police have messed with him too much in the past. But there's also a DEA investigation into the Cuban drug lord, and that's where Marcus' sister gets involved. Now, this movie is not just a redo of the first movie. In this one, Mike is dating Marcus' sister without Marcus knowing, and Marcus wants to transfer and hasn't told Mike yet. This leads to the two characters getting into the eternal conflict with their partnership, the conflict that's going to really put their partnership to the test. Now, that was something that wasn't explored in the first movie. The first movie was just to get the characters to appreciate each other, even though they were both on opposite ends of the spectrum, Mike being the rich bachelor, and Marcus being the family man with a wife and 3 kids, as I stated prior. The biggest issue with this movie is because it's a sequel to an action movie, the filmmakers and studio feel like they need to make the action bigger. You see this with the Klan rally. I know that this was here to set up the plot for the ecstasy ring, but the fallout when Mike and Marcus have to shoot up the joint feels like it has the same amount of action that was at the very end of the first movie with all the cops eventually swarming the Klan and the explosions that were going off left and right. Then you have the chase involving the Haitians. At some point, the Haitians hijack a truck that carries a lot of the cars, and they start dropping them off the truck one by one. The chase becomes Mike just trying to avoid all the cars dropping off the truck. Then there's yet another car chase involving the Cubans, And now this was after Mike and Marcus blackmailed the Klansmen into helping him find the drug boat. The van that was carrying the bodies to the morgue was being chased and the Cubans took over a bank. Once Mike and Marcus reached that point, it became a shootout. And by this point in the movie, the car chase sequences just became too much. Now, if this movie had ended with the drug bust and arresting the drug lord, then it would have made this movie better despite being more over the top in terms of the action in the first movie. But we need to have Marcus's sister be an undercover DEA agent that gets kidnapped and taken to Cuba. That's where Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett go from being narcotics cops to working in tangent with other guys from the squad, along with the DEA and FBI to sneak into Cuba and get sit out, essentially pull off a spec ops mission. And this is where the movie extends by 30 minutes. This sequence starts with an attack on Johnny Tapia's estate in Cuba, then it carries over into yet another car chase that ends in a minefield just outside of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. It is agreed upon by the fans of Bad Boys that this movie simply ran 30 minutes too long. The whole Cuba sequence could have been avoided, but with the Cuba sequence, this movie was just over the top, just to be over the top in terms of action. Now, what was the reception of Bad Boys 2? Well, this movie on Rotten Tomatoes has a critic score of 23% out of 183 critic reviews, and an audience score of 78% out of 501,862 reviews. It has a Metacritic score of 38 out of 34 critic reviews, and a user score of 4.1 out of 10 out of 518 ratings. This movie sits on IMDb at 6.6 out of 10 out of 224,100 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $130 million back in 2002-2003. Now, the budget adjusted for inflation in 2020 dollars would be $181,144,402.17. And it grossed worldwide back in 2003, $273,339,556. Adjusted for inflation, it would be $380,876,388.17. Now, what was the drop-off between Bad Boys and Bad Boys 2? Well, first I adjusted the worldwide gross of Bad Boys for inflation in 2003 numbers, since that's when Bad Boys 2 came out. And after I did that, I divided the worldwide gross of Bad Boys 2 and the original, and actually got an increase of 160.1% between sequels in terms of box office gross. Now, if we want to get more technical, the average ticket price in 1995 was only $4.35, and the average ticket price in 2003 was $6.03. After doing the math, that's an increase of 138.6% between 1995 and 2003. Now, I don't want to try to calculate how many people saw each movie, because there's one unmeasurable variable that can't be ignored, and that's repeat viewings. How many repeat viewings were there of the first and second movie? That's a question that you or I cannot answer, because it's something that's completely unmeasurable. Now, just some final thoughts on Bad Boys 2. This would have made a good sequel if the Cuba sequence wasn't in it. All Cuba did was make it too over the top in terms of action, and it really didn't add anything else to the movie. The character growth was natural for a sequel if the first movie forced the partners to respect one another, even though they were on opposite ends of the spectrum. Then the sequel needed to be an internal conflict with the characters just to have them make up at the end and be bad boys for life. Now, this movie suffers from the exact same thing that The Great Escape suffers from. It has a good ending until Steve McQueen just had a ride on the motorcycle. The Cuba sequence in this movie was Steve McQueen riding that motorcycle at the end of The Great Escape. It just killed the fucking ending. Now we've made it to Bad Boys for Life, the movie that we waited 17 years for. So let's start off with the returning characters. We've got Mike Lowry. He gets shot in this movie and wants to hunt down the person who did this to him. He then gets told that he has to work with the Ammo Squad. Basically, he can't go at it alone. He can't pull an O.J. Simpson. Then we have Marcus Burnett. He wants to retire in this movie, and he ultimately does at one point before coming back to join Mike Lowry in his investigation. Now, it makes sense that he wants to retire given that most cops are retired by the age of 50. And then we actually do get Captain Howard to come back. It's the same Captain Howard from the first two movies, but really dies unceremoniously, in my opinion. He gets shot by the same guy that wants to make Mike Lowry, quote-unquote, suffer, and I'll get into that when we get into the narrative. Now, the new characters in this movie are Vanessa Hudgens as Kelly. She's part of the Ammo Squad. Alexander Ludwig as Dorn, part of the Ammo Squad. And Charles Melton as Rafe, part of the Ammo Squad. Then we have Paola Nunez as Rita. Now, she's casted as a potential love interest for Mike, and she's also the leader of the Ammo Squad. Then we have Kate del Castillo as Isabel Aretas. Yeah, try saying that fast 3 times. A woman from Mike Lowry's past that wants to kill him for putting her away in a Mexican jail for life along with killing her husband. Then we have Jacob Scipio. Sorry, I can't pronounce his name. That's Scipio as Armando Aretas, the son of Isabel that is carrying out her deeds, killing everyone involved in the case against her from the mid-90s. Now let's get into the narrative of Bad Boys for Life. Now, the plot surrounding this movie isn't about bringing down a drug lord or even a cartel for that matter. It's a revenge story. A woman that Mike Lowry screwed over 25 years ago broke out of prison, and she's using her son to kill not only Mike, but everyone who was responsible for putting her in prison. Now, this plot ultimately leads down a rabbit hole that ends with Mike Lowry has a son. Mike Lowry's son is hunting him down and trying to kill him. Now, if this plot sounds familiar, it's actually very similar to another movie that Will Smith did a year prior to this one coming out called Gemini Man. But in Gemini Man, the person hunting him down in that movie wasn't his son, it was his clone. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence that Jerry Bruckheimer produced both Bad Boys for Life and Gemini Man. So for both to have the same plot outcome, yeah, I don't believe in coincidences. Now, so to get back to Bad Boys 3, this twist that Mike Lowry had a son really didn't do anything for me. I felt that it just came so out of left field right after the point when they made this hitman character just extremely one-dimensional. So it just became a whole, what can we do to save him? Well, let's just make him Mike's son. Let's make him Mike's son. Ding, ding, ding. That's how we'll save this character. If the plot was going to be surrounded by revenge, why not have it be the daughter of the Cuban drug lord that Mike killed at the end of Bad Boys 2? It's been 17 years. Bad Boys 2 came out in 2003 and Bad Boys for Life came out in 2020 for those who don't know or are watching this in the future. So the girl would have been an adult by this point. What that would have done is it would have made the Cuba sequence in Bad Boys 2 more meaningful, whereas now by Bad Boys 3, it was completely meaningless. Mike Lowry broke up with Marcus's sister by this movie, so what was the point of running the spec op in Cuba to save her if it ultimately was going to be nothing in the future sequels? So what was the reception that Bad Boys for Life got? Well, on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has a critic score of 77% out of 249 critic reviews and an audience score of 96% out of 42,932 audience reviews. It has a Metacritic score of 59 out of 46 critic reviews and a user score of 6.7 out of 10 out of 204 ratings. Now, this movie sits on IMDb at a 6.7 out of 10 out of 90,198 reviews. Now, this movie had a budget of $90 million and it grossed worldwide $419,074,646. There's no need to adjust either number for inflation since this movie came out in January of 2020. But this is the highest grossing Bad Boys movie, even taking inflation into account. Now, what was the gain in box office between Bad Boys 2 and Bad Boys for Life? Obviously, adjusted for inflation. Well, it had a gain of 110%. If you look at the average price of a movie ticket, by the end of 2019, it was $9.37, but back in 2003, it was $6.03, so that was an increase of 155.3% in the average movie ticket price, if we're being honest. Now, what was the gain in box office between the first Bad Boys and Bad Boys for Life? Well, that had a gain, after adjusted for inflation, of course, 176.1%. Now, the average ticket price back in 1995 was $4.35, as I stated prior in this episode. And if we look at the rise in the average movie ticket price between 1995 and by the end of 2019, that was an increase of 215.4%. So my final thoughts on Bad Boys for Life is that this movie was the weakest in the series narratively. This movie tried to set up a new squad that no one knows about called the Ammo Squad. Is it connected to homicide? Is it connected to narcotics? We don't know. If this was your first Bad Boys movie, what point in this movie would make you think that Mike and Marcus were narcotics cops? Maybe the Ammo Squad will be expanded upon in Bad Boys 4 if that ever happens. Remember, we waited 17 years between Bad Boys 2 and this movie was the first. In this movie and the first movie, we waited 8 years, 1995 to 2003. So there was a setup for Bad Boys 4 immediately following the end of the title screen that sees Mike go and visit his son in prison, telling him that there could be a way for him to reduce his sentence. But we need to wait to see if this really is going to go anywhere. Now, to end this episode, let me go into my final thoughts on the Bad Boys series as a whole. Now, this series, more particularly the first movie, highlights how blockbusters were made back in the day. They were obviously made to make money like they are now. But back 25, 30 years ago, the filmmakers and studios were probably thinking, let's make a movie that will not only make us a lot of money in the here and now, but will continue making us money for the next 25 to 30 years, because everyone's going to want to come back and watch this particular movie. Now, this series of movies is also an anomaly in terms of blockbusters in the sense that every movie following the first one made more money than the previous. The rule for franchises is the longer they go on, the more money they lose. It's called the Law of Diminishing Returns. Now, I have to attribute this to the years between sequels. This series was going back 25 years, back to 1995. But now it only has 3 movies. So this series essentially wasn't sequelized to death. Now, there was a rise in average movie ticket prices from 1995 to 2020. So that can be taken into consideration, because if you actually look at the numbers between Bad Boys 2 and Bad Boys 3, Bad Boys 3 didn't gross that much more than Bad Boys 2 if you adjust the numbers for inflation. So did the audience grow, or did it just get more expensive to go to the movies? Now, I will end the episode off with this final thought. If a Bad Boys 4 is going to get made, they cannot wait 10 plus years to do it. They're going to have to do it probably within the next 5. So by the year 2025. And I say that because Will Smith isn't getting any younger, along with Martin Lawrence. Will Smith is now 51 and Martin Lawrence is now 55. You can't do a Bad Boys movie without Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. It's like doing a Men in Black movie without Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. It just won't work. Just go ask Men in Black International and ask how well that movie did without Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith.